Whereas in order to ensure an uninterrupted flow of federal transportation funding to the region, Stratford MPO must act on Amendment 3 to the Transportation Improvement Program and Safety Performance Targets. Whereas the committee chair, which I guess is me, has decided that immediate action is imperative and the physical presence of a quorum is not reasonably practical within the period of time requiring action due to the ongoing pandemic and our impending inclement weather. Whereas this constitutes an emergency per RSA 91A:2, Roman 2. Therefore, the Stratford MPO TAC will invoke this emergency provision and waive requirement for a quorum at the physical location of the meeting. And with that, we'll bring the meeting to order and start with introductions. Oh, what did I just do?
Is everyone seeing the agenda by chance?
Yes.
On the screen share? Okay, good. All right. If it's easiest, I can just go around the screen here on my end. Let's see. I think I'm seeing everyone.
Hey, Colin.
Yes.
We can't see everyone though when you screen share.
Okay.
Awesome.
Better.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. I'll go first. Colin Lentz with Stratford Regional Planning Commission. Glad to have you all here. Bruce, why don't we just start with you, even though you started?
Yes, Bruce Woodruff from the town of Milton.
Tim?
Tim White, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Air Resources Division.
Jen?
Jen Sis, Stratford Regional Planning Commission.
Katrin?
Katrin Casper, Select Person Lee, New Hampshire.
Rachel?
Rachel Dewey, Stratford Regional Planning Commission.
Michelle?
Michelle Mears, City of Somersworth.
Megan? Megan, did we lose you? There you go.
Megan Taylor Feder, SRPC.
Karen?
Karen Rossi, Planning and Zoning Administrator, Town of Lee.
Kim?
Kim Romo, State of New Hampshire Transportation.
Luann? You're muted, Luann, sorry.
Thank you. Luann Spikers. I'm the new Title VI coordinator with the Federal Office of Compliance within DOT, and I'm literally brand new. I have about 15 days under me, so this is a big learning curve for me. So I'm just excited to learn more about what all of you folks do and how we will interact and intersect around Title VI.
Great. Let me know if you want to set up a time to chat with me and our other Title VI official people about our process and stuff, so we can give you a little info.
I will absolutely take you up on that, because the more I learn and understand and the quicker I do this stuff, it'll all sort of start to make sense. So I will definitely reach out to you, Colin.
Great.
Thank you.
Just for the heck of it, I'll put my email in the chat, so you have that in case you didn't have it already.
I didn't, so I will I'll grab it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Amelia?
Amelia DeGrace, Dover, New Hampshire, Assistant City Engineer.
You're welcome. Everything shifted around. Leigh?
Good morning, Leigh Levine, Federal Highway Administration.
Michael?
Michael Williams, Coast.
Jackson?
Hi, Jackson Rand with SRPC.
Nancy?
Good morning, Nancy O'Connor, SRPC.
And Stephen?
Stephen Geis, SRPC.
Great. Again, thank you all for joining us. I have a couple of things to talk about, and then I'm going to leave most of the time as much as I can to Leigh Levine to talk about all of the programs and opportunities in the federal infrastructure package. So do you all want me to share my screen, or do you all have the agenda and all that stuff in front of you to look through?
Share away. Sorry, I was just being fussy because I like seeing.
I think that was good for the introduction at least.
Thank you.
Mhm. All right. So I guess minutes first, if you don't mind, Bruce, lead us through that.
Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes from November 5th,
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
and that is,
Michelle Mears.
thank you, Michelle. Anybody willing to give us a second on that? While I get rid of my cat.
Yeah, I'll second that.
Thank you, Michael.
Does anybody have any changes or any discussion of these minutes before we take a vote? All right, hearing none. All those in favor, I guess you're supposed to do a roll call vote.
We have to do a roll
Okay.
call in this case. Yeah, so
All right.
I'll go around the room. Tim?
Yes.
Katrin?
What are you doing?
Yes.
Amelia?
Can I abstain?
Yep. Michelle?
Yes.
Karen?
I'm not an actual sworn member, so I abstain.
Okay. Kim?
Yes.
And Michael?
Yes.
I think that's all the voting members.
Except
Thank
for
you.
me. And the
Except
chair
for-
votes, and the chair votes yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right, I'll go into Amendment 3 here. Sorry, scrolling through. So starting on the 8th, next week, we have an amendment to the tip for new people. This is the four-year program of projects that start in year 21 and go out to 2024. These are federally funded projects, infrastructure projects and programs that are kind of in process. Once a project makes it into this plan, it has defined engineering cost estimate and scope, and either the DOT is running it, or the municipality, or the agency, whichever. There are only 3 projects in this amendment. Amendments are for larger changes involving a major change to the scope of a project, or large changes to the funding amounts in it. So I can tell folks more about that after if there are questions. The primary thing to look at on this one is for Dover, project number 41373. This is the community trail expansion, the southern portion of it, that goes through the schools and through the Bellamy Park. It looks like, if you look at the approved funding and the proposed funding, it looks like project funding was removed, but it just went out to year 2025. So I'll be on 2024. It's still there. I talked with Donna Benton in Dover, and she confirmed that this is all good to go, that they're working on project pieces, and all the funding is still there. It hasn't gone away. It just moved out due to engineering and all of those processes. The other 2 changes were for statewide programmatics. This is municipally owned bridge restoration and repair. These are large programs, and within them there are child projects. So if we had a bridge in one of our towns, that would be called a child project. The changes in here do not affect any of the child projects in our region. But that program is specifically set up for bridges that are owned by municipalities. The only other program, sorry, is for CRDR, stands for culvert replacement. I forget what the D is, but these are culverts. So a tube under a road instead of a bridge. And again, this is a large programmatic that has many millions of dollars for replacing and repairing culverts across the state. In this case, none of the proposed changes affect any culvert projects in our region. I can go into more detail if folks want, or if they have questions, but that's pretty much the scope of the amendment. It's going to be in a public comment period for 10 days, starting on the 8th. And after that 10 days, our policy committee will be reviewing it with any additional input that you have or public comments.
And we're looking for a recommendation to the policy
Correct.
committee on this.
Policy for their approval. So if there aren't any other questions, I think we can put it to a vote.
Yeah, I'll officially make the motion to recommend this TIP amendment 3 to the policy committee.
All right, thank you.
I can second that.
Thank you, Michael.
Discussion? Hearing none, we'll take a roll call vote on this motion.
I'll go around. Bruce,
The chair votes yes.
Amelia,
Yes.
Tim,
Yes.
Michelle,
Yes.
Katrin.
Yes.
Making sure. Kim,
I think I'm supposed to abstain, aren't I?
I think so. Yes.
So yeah,
for the amendment.
yes.
Michael
Yes.
and Luann, I'm not sure. Are you an appointed member, or are you joining us for kind of information to be part of the conversation here? If
That's
you're
a
from
great
Department of-
question. And actually, I don't really know the answer to it. Was my understanding, it's really just to learn and understand and get an idea of what, the RPCs and MPOs do. So.
If you're from DOS, I'd have to double check our.
No, I'm actually from DOT. I came from
Okay.
DOS. I'm
Okay.
I'm within the Office of Federal Compliance at DOT.
Okay, so I mean, we have Kim here, who's our voting representative, so we can add you as an alternate in the future if that would be beneficial for everyone. But otherwise, I think DOT is spoken for. So just making sure.
All right. Yeah, what's interesting is I'm looking at this stuff, just to throw it out. I actually came from the Office of Highway Safety, where I managed grants for the local police departments. So obviously there's an intersect here with the Strategic Highway Safety Plan and
Yes.
the Highway Safety Plan, which is the HSP, which I, for the 8 years that I was there, was intimately involved with.
Yeah, I was part of the committee helping on that, and we'd love to talk to you about your past work as it pertains
Yeah,
to
absolutely. Absolutely.
So good segue into the safety targets if everyone's ready to go on to that. This comes from Luann's world as well as DOT. So every year, the MPOs and state departments of transportation set targets for the federal measures for highway safety. There on the screen, those 5. Oh, and I forgot to change the PDF, sorry. The number of fatalities, the rate of those fatalities, the number of serious injuries, the rate of serious injuries, and then the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. So the numbering got screwed up on the PDF there, but there are 5 federally required measures. We also look at motorcycle fatalities as a supplemental because motorcycle use is so high in New Hampshire, but that's a separate additional thing we look at. So I'm just going to walk through a few of the pieces here to give you the high level look at this. We have a few sources for the analysis we do on this. The Fatality Analysis Reporting System, that is a federal database of crashes that resulted in a fatality. That is, we have direct access to that. It is highly accurate because of the detailed reporting requirements. Because it involves fatalities, we want to know as much as we can about what happened in each crash so that we can do something about them in the future, is kind of the gist. The state has a crash database. Accuracy is highly variable within that because there are so many towns submitting reports on crashes. Some of them come in, well, many of them are reported on paper and are either scanned or mailed to the Department of Safety. The location of crashes in that case is the biggest challenge. Not every community has the resources to have iPads or GIS systems. So they're using addresses or various coordinate systems. And so the serious injury crashes, we sometimes have a hard time finding those. In most cases, if I have a safety issue that a town wants me to investigate, I just talk directly to the police department and request crash reports, and that's the easiest way to find out what happened. Then we have the highway performance monitoring system that's where we get the vehicle miles traveled that helps us set targets. So just the headline here is that we are supporting the state targets set by DOT 180 days ago. That we track the crashes in our region, our kind of proportion of the statewide crashes, but we support the state targets, and that basically means we're going to do everything we can to reduce our proportion of crashes in our region. Just a big note on that for folks that don't study this is that, you know, most crashes are caused by driver behavior and are distributed essentially randomly across the landscape. We can identify problem intersections and so forth and help DOT and the municipalities do something about those. And so we target those locations. I talked to one of our RPC partners, and they're getting into addressing that behavior-based issue by doing some outreach around it. I'm interested in learning more about how they did that, to talk to people about speeding and distracted driving and so forth. Scrolling down here a little bit. I'm just going to stay here. So this is the overall table of the kind of the 5-year average. You see, starting from 2020 and going back a few years, we use a 5-year rolling average to smooth the curve of crashes, because the non-motorized in particular will have a low year and a really high year, and then a low year and a really high year. And so it kind of smooths it out so that we can look at the trends over time a little more accurately. So as I said, we're supporting the state targets, but you can see the darker colored lines there. That's our regional proportion. The SRPC region counts for about, Rachel's going to have to be back up in case I say something stupid, but about 9% of the statewide vehicle miles traveled, and 11% of the crashes on average, as it stands. So we use that as a benchmark. So you can see at the top rows, our regional proportion of fatalities is about 13, based on the most recent rolling average of 5 years. So as you can see, 2020 is the most current year we have for a complete data set. as I said, people submit on paper, and it takes a while for the state to be able to process all that so that we can get a full accounting. So we're just into 2022, so they're going to be having 2021 soon, but not in time for our target setting. So there's a bit of a lag, but we try to keep up. So you see there are not targets set for the rate of fatalities and serious injuries. In the SRPC, because, and the reason we don't show that is because the way that vehicle miles traveled and the crashes in our region come out, it looks like we have a higher rate than the state, because on average, the regional share of vehicle miles traveled is less than the share of fatalities and serious injury crashes. So it kind of looks wonky. And so we're just supporting the state on that one. Otherwise, it looks like we're supporting a higher target than the rest of the state. Any questions so far? Things people want me to dive in a little deeper? All right. Just want to talk about, or I thought I saw someone come up. Okay. Just a few trends and issues to kind of round this out. Of course, 2020 was a really weird year. During the pandemic, there was a period of really low traffic volumes, but overall the fatalities over the course of the year stayed consistent compared to previous years. So that really skewed the rate. And there are continuing impacts from the pandemic, of course. New Hampshire still does not have an adult seatbelt law, where adult drivers are not required to wear seatbelts by law. That gets into personal choice issues, but seatbelts save lives, and so there's a lot of advocacy for encouraging people to wear seatbelts and to have a state law in New Hampshire to do that. Impaired driving is a major cause of fatalities and serious injuries. And unfortunately, on our end, we can't really fix that with infrastructure changes, with a stop sign or a roundabout. If someone's impaired, there's only so much we can do with the road design. And the opioid crisis is a huge part of that. So I'm really interested on the behavior side of things and doing things like designing roads so that people intuitively drive slower. That's a big thing that we can do to make it apparent that when someone's getting close to a town center or driving through a neighborhood, that they have to slow down because of the way that the road is designed. The turnpike and interstates, those are designed for high speed, high volume, but we don't want to use the same engineering principles on our regional arterial roads like 108 and in downtowns and on local streets. So we are going to be working with DOT and our municipalities on things like that. As we're designing projects, having a really hard focus on safety. As I said, I'm interested in working with our municipalities and police departments on the behavior side of things, where how people drive is really a major impact on the safety of others on the public roads. So it's sort of a continuing process. Last thing I'll say on safety, I always remind people, if you have an intersection or a set stretch of road in your municipality where you have had a history of crashes, specifically ones that resulted in serious injuries or hopefully not, but in case fatalities, I can help you apply for funding to DOT to address those intersections very, very quickly. It's called a road safety audit. It's free to apply for. And in most cases, it's a 100% federally funded set of alternatives that is done in collaboration with the DOT, a consultant, and local staff. So with that was a lot of information. Any questions on this? Safety targets, safety in general?
Colin, are we looking for a motion on this as well? Is this an action item?
Yes, please. All right, if there are no other questions, I think we can move it to a vote.
Come on.
All right, I think if you can call for a motion if you want, Bruce, or if someone wants to go for it.
Well, I would like to have somebody make a motion other than me.
I'll make a motion to recommend this to the policy committee. Is that right?
Yes.
Second. That's
Thank you, Michael
Michelle.
and Michelle.
Any further discussion on the motion? Hearing and seeing none. Let's call the vote on this.
Why don't you take us, start us off, Bruce?
The chair votes yes.
All right, Amelia?
Yes.
Tim?
Yes.
Katrin?
Yes.
Michelle?
Yes.
Kim?
Yes.
And Michael?
Yes.
All right. Thank you all. Leigh, I hope I left you enough time here. Let me get your presentation up. All right. Welcome to, wait, is Leigh still here? Oh, I saw
Yes,
him.
I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Okay. Oh, yeah. Your name was replaced by a camera. So my thanks for Leigh for being here to talk about the infrastructure bill. It's gigantic. There are a lot of opportunities and a lot of money, and grateful for him to be here to walk us through some of the ways that municipalities can be ready to take advantage of that.
All righty. Thank you, Colin and Jen and everybody for allowing me some time here to go through all this information. I really appreciate it. This is actually the first of these types of presentations that I'm doing. I offered this to all the MPOs and RPCs, and Colin was the first to take me up on it. So appreciate that. Hoping to do it in person, but alas, we're not able to do that today. So this will do. So the BIL, yes, otherwise known or also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or EJA or IJA, but it seems more the fashion to refer to it now as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or bill, and that's what I'll be referring to as we go through these slides. It was enacted November 15th, 2021. The law itself is over 1,000 pages, I think 1,039 pages. So full disclosure, I have not read all of that. In fact, most of what I've read is really some of the same summary information that you may have seen that's out there. So I am no expert, but we will go through this together. And again, it's going to be more of an overview, highlighting, kind of what's new and what's transformative about the new authorization. Lots of new programs, lots of new money. For New Hampshire, over 1.4 billion in formula funds alone. So there's a lot in it. This slideshow was originally about 70 plus slides, and I winnowed it down to 40. I wanted to highlight what I thought would be of most interest to this audience, and so hopefully it will be. So I'd suggest that we just kind of blow through these slides here. If you have questions, things come up, or comments, feel free to use the chat pod. And if we have some time afterwards, we can try to circle back to that. And Colin, thank you for advancing the slides. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm sorry.
Did it advance?
Yes,
Okay.
it did. Yep, we're good. Thank you.
A little lag.
All right, so the BIL, it's been described as a once in a generation investment in infrastructure to grow the economy, about $550 billion in new federal funds in infrastructure. The largest dedicated bridge investment since construction of the interstate system, largest investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure in history. It also makes significant investments in other kinds of infrastructure, including water, wastewater, clean energy, broadband, et cetera. And on average, it's expected to support around 2 million jobs a year. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so here's some of the provisions, the highway provisions, some high points here. It's funding highway programs and activities for 5 years, so that's through September 30th, 2026. About $305 billion in contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund. So on average, on an annual basis, about 29% more federal aid funding than the current law for fiscal year 2021 levels. It also includes about $43.7 billion in advance appropriations from the general fund. So these are monies coming from the general fund to support and kind of augment the Highway Trust Fund money. More than a dozen new highway programs. So there's 2 new apportion funding programs. We'll talk more about this in subsequent slides as we go through this. 2 new formula programs relating to bridges and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and several new discretionary grant programs, which we'll talk about as well. And then to kind of, again, to kind of keep things solvent here, the highway account of the Highway Trust Fund would receive about that $90 billion in transfer from the general funds. Okay, next slide, please. So here you see, this is one of the things that's really different, transformative, new about this legislation. You know, traditionally FHWA provides funding, most of our funding, through apportioned programs to states and territories. But the BIL continues that, but there are several of the new discretionary programs include eligibility for local governments, MPOs, tribes, territories, federal land management agencies, and other entities. And this table doesn't include all of the BIL programs or eligible entities. There are some additional nuances here. For instance, several of the programs, there are population-based requirements limiting which MPOs are eligible to apply. FHWA expects to administer most of these programs, but this table includes some that are going to be administered by the Office of the Secretary. And so anyway, just wanted to give you an idea of the depth of the range of recipients that are eligible for these funds now. All right, next slide, please. So now we'll go through and talk about the apportioned or the contract authority programs, and I'll note, I guess, that changes we'll also cover some changes related to metropolitan planning and the MPO process and PL funding as part of this later in the presentation. Okay. So here we see a slide that shows the amount of contract authority for each of the 8 apportioned or formula programs over the 5 federal fiscal years. So you can have a look at that. STBG, which is very broad category of federal aid funding, 5 years, $72 billion. It includes that 10% set aside for the transportation alternatives program that many of you are familiar with. The HSIP total, $15.6 billion, excluding the Railway Highway Crossing Program. 2 new apportion programs, the Carbon Reduction Program and the PROTECT Program, which addresses resiliency. And we'll cover that a little bit later in the presentation. So let's go to the next slide, please.
Leigh, can I just translate a few of the acronyms for a couple of new people? The transportation alternatives. Transportation alternatives is for non-motorized projects like bicycle and pedestrian. HSIP is Highway Safety Improvement Program, so kind of addressing some of the safety issues we talked about. and then CMAC is congestion mitigation and air quality improvement. So projects that reduce congestion, which leads to poorer air quality. Things like transit, bike and ped projects as well that don't have any emissions. So,
Correct. No, thank you. All right. So now we'll talk about some of the changes to some of these major formula programs, and one of them being the National Highway Performance Program, or NHPP program. The BIL adds an additional program purpose to this category of funds, which is providing support for activities to increase the resiliency of the National Highway System, or the NHS. These NHPP funds are really focused on the National Highway System, the NHS. Second, the Act improves or includes several new eligible activities, including resiliency improvements on the NHS, protective features on federal aid highways and bridges off the NHS, which is capped at 15%. And finally, it requires that states' asset management plans consider extreme weather and resilience and life cycle cost and risk management analysis. And the AMPS group at New Hampshire DOT is aware of this, and they are going to be working on modifying the state's Transportation Asset Management Plan, or TAMP. Okay, next slide, please. STBG, or Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. This is one of the most broadly eligible federal aid funding categories. You can do almost anything with these funds, including planning. Several changes to this category of funds as well. Includes several new eligible activities, such as electric vehicle charging infrastructure, protective features to enhance resilience, and wildlife crossing projects, for example. Increases the set aside for off-system bridges and allows funds to be used to replace low water crossings with a bridge. Does not make any changes to the existing off-system bridge waiver process. And then for purposes of distributing suballocated funding by urbanized area population, there's two new population categories, 5,000 to 50,000, and then 50,000 to 200,000, versus the current legislation, which lumps all that together in the 5 to 200,000 category. It includes a new requirement for states to consult with regional transportation planning organizations and MPOs representing urbanized areas with populations of 50 to 200,000 before using certain suballocated funding. And finally, there's also the Act permits states to use up to 15% of STBG funds to essentially work on projects in rural areas. All right, next slide, please. Great. So, and as Colin mentioned, the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is a set aside from the STBG pot of funds. Some changes to this program here as well. Increases the amount of funding for TA set aside to 10% of the total STBG funds per fiscal year. So that's $7.2 billion over fiscal years 22 to 26. Increases a portion of TA funds that are suballocated to areas of the state based on population from 50 to 59%. And although states can continue to transfer up to 50% of these funds to other apportioned programs, the BIL establishes new requirements that states must meet before transferring these funds. It allows states to use up to 5% of the TA funds after suballocation to fund staff to administer the program. And the Act also reaffirms eligibility for safe routes to school projects and activities related to vulnerable road user safety assessments also. It adds eligible entities, MPOs, representing urbanized areas with populations of 200,000 or fewer, nonprofit entities, and states at the request of another eligible entity. Let's see, it also, yes, the federal share provides for a federal share of up to 100% for TA projects and activities, allows HSIP funds to be used for the non-federal match for these projects. Also allows non-federal share requirements to be met on an aggregate basis rather than for each individual project. So those are some new things with the TA program under the new legislation. Okay, next slide, please. HSIP program, safety funds that were mentioned earlier, some changes. Adding eligibility for specified safety projects allows the state to spend up to 10% of its HSIP apportionment on such activities, which includes non-infrastructure safety projects related to education, research, enforcement, emergency services, and safe routes to schools. It modifies the definition, the HSIP definition of highway safety improvement project by adding or clarifying some project types. Adds a new requirement for states to complete vulnerable road user safety assessments. And finally, adds a new special rule for states with vulnerable road user fatalities that make up 15% or more of total annual crash fatalities in a state. So more emphasis here as we see on kind of vulnerable road safety, vulnerable user road safety. All right, next one. So the CMAC program, as Colin mentioned earlier, some notable changes here as well. Several new eligibilities, including for shared micromobility, like bike sharing and shared electric scooters, that kind of thing. Diesel replacements, medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles and related charging equipment. And in certain circumstances, modernization or rehab of a lock and dam or a marine highway corridor connector crossing, which is interesting. Allows program funds to be used for rail or transit operating assistance without time limitation in association with certain CMAC projects located in certain areas. I'm sure we'll get more information guidance on that. And finally, this doesn't really affect New Hampshire so much. We don't have an issue with PM particulate matter here, but it requires the maximum extent practical, prioritizing disadvantaged communities or low-income populations when obligating funds to address PM 2.5. Okay, next slide. As we continue on, changes to the National Highway Freight Program. So NHFP or freight-focused funding was really introduced with the last Authorization Act, and this the BIL continues this program with a few changes. It increases the amount of NHFP funding that can be used for freight intermodal or freight rail projects from 10 to 30%, subject to certain restrictions. It adds eligibility for modernization and rehabilitation of, again, lock and dam, marine highway corridors, connectors, et cetera. And finally, the act allows the designation of more miles as critical rural freight corridors and critical urban freight corridors. With those designations, whatever those corridors that are designated, they become eligible for these funds. And I believe in New Hampshire, I don't know that we have any additional designations of those corridors presently, but that's another change in this program. Okay, so let's talk safety. The next section, we're going to talk about safe streets and roads for all, a couple new programs, another one, wildlife crossings pilot program, and some other provisions. So let's move on. So this is new. It establishes a new discretionary grant program. So these are competitively awarded funds to support local Vision Zero and related initiatives to prevent transportation-related deaths and serious injuries. About $1 billion in each of the federal fiscal years, and eligible entities. So this is available for MPOs, for local governments. Tribal governments are eligible to compete for this funding. And notably, states are not eligible for this funding, although they already receive, as we know, HSIP funds. Eligible projects can be used for, planning grants to develop comprehensive safety action plans. And 40% of the funding is set aside for that use each fiscal year. It can be used for planning, design, development activities for infrastructure projects and strategies. And in awarding these grants, DOT is required to consider the extent to which each applicant and eligible project is likely to significantly reduce or eliminate transportation-related fatalities and serious injuries involving various road users. So that's the new Safe Streets and Roads for All discretionary program. Next slide, please. Okay, another new program, Wildlife Crossing, focused on the safety of drivers as well as protecting wildlife and habitat connectivity, improving that as well. So this is a pilot program. It's going to provide some discretionary grants for projects that seek to reduce the number of wildlife vehicle collisions and improve that habitat connectivity. About $350 million over the federal fiscal years. And eligible entities for this one include state highway agencies, MPOs, local governments, regional transportation authorities, and others. It's set aside not less than 60% of grant funds each fiscal year for projects in rural areas. And a provision related to the pilot program also requires a study of methods to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, workforce development, technical training courses, and a standardized methodology for collecting and reporting spatially accurate location data on these wildlife collisions. So another new program there. This one a pilot program. Okay, next one, other safety related provisions. So a few other things to note here. The bill defines complete street standards and policies and requires state to use at least 2.5% of their SPR, their planning and research funds, towards one or more activities related to complete streets or multimodal travel. There's a similar requirement here for MPOs to use at least 2.5% of their metropolitan planning or PL funds for the same activities. There's also two sections of the act related to the MUTCD, Manual and Uniform Transportation Control Devices, requiring the MUTC to be updated within 18 months of enactment so that it includes mobility for all users and protection of vulnerable road users to the greatest extent possible. All right, so let's move on to climate and resilience. So lots of new stuff going on and new programs, new funding programs, all kinds of things going on here. So let's just dive right into it. The first new program is a formula program. It's called the Carbon Reduction Program, supporting projects designed to reduce transportation emissions, meaning carbon dioxide emissions from on-road highway sources. Some examples of eligible projects include public transportation projects, trail facilities, projects or strategies that support congestion pricing or other shifts in transportation demand, for example. And this authorizes $6.4 billion over the 5-year period coming from the Highway Trust Fund. The recipients and distribution. So these are, again, formula funds. So they're, the BIL requires 65% of these carbon reduction program funds be suballocated according to population with 4 population categories. Carbon reduction strategies. States are required to develop a carbon reduction strategy in consultation with MPOs. And these strategies are required to identify projects and strategies to reduce transportation emissions. US DOT will review the state's process for developing that strategy and certify that it meets statutory requirements. And then the first carbon reduction strategy is due within 2 years of enactment. All right, let's move on to the next one as we blow through this stuff here. The PROTECT program, so which stands for Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation, otherwise known as PROTECT. So this is a new formula program. And the bill authorizes $7.3 billion over the 5-year period coming from the trust fund. These are apportioned by formula to the states. States can use these apportioned funds for highway projects, public transportation facilities or services, port facilities. Projects can include the use of natural infrastructure or the construction or modification of storm surge, flood protection, aquatic ecosystem restoration elements that are functionally connected to a transportation improvement. This is interesting. The non-federal share of a project shall be reduced by 7 percentage points if a state develops a resilience improvement plan that prioritizes the project, and shall be reduced by 3 percentage points if the state has incorporated a resilience improvement plan into its long-range transportation plan, and may not be reduced by more than 10 percentage points for a single project. The states may not use more than 40% of their apportioned funds in this category for construction of any new capacity, and they can't use more than 10% for development phase activities. So that is the new Protect kind of resilience focused program. All right, moving on, Protect grants. So that was the formula. This is the same program. These are the competitive discretionary grants that are made available. About 1.4 billion for the discretionary part of the program here coming from the trust fund. Let's see here. Funds for the discretionary component will be distributed by competitive grants with 4 different categories, including planning grants, resilience improvement grants, community resilience and evacuation route grants, and at-risk coastal infrastructure grants. And as you see, a lot of eligible entities here, including state, local, tribal governments, as well as MPOs and federal land management agencies. Eligible projects can include highway projects, public transportation facilities, services, facility or service for intercity rail transportation, and port facilities. The federal share for the cost of the planning activity carried out for the planning grant portion of this is 100%. And the federal share of the cost of a project carried out using other grants shall not exceed 80%. The eligible entity can use federal funds other than federal funds for this discretionary grant program to meet the non-federal cost share requirements. And as with the formula program for Protect, states can take steps to reduce the non-federal share up to 10 percentage points. So that's the discretionary side of that program, Protect. Another new program, charging and fueling infrastructure. So this is discretionary grants to fund the strategic deployment of publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure and hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling infrastructure along designated corridors. 2.5 billion over 5 years. Funds for this are going to be distributed, that's discretionary, by competitive grants, and eligible entities include state, local, and other entities. Eligible projects here: acquisition and installation of publicly accessible charging or fueling infrastructure, traffic control devices. Let's see. The law reserves 50% of the amounts made available each fiscal year for community grants that are expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to expand or fill gaps to access to publicly accessible charging and fueling infrastructure. These projects can be located on any public road or in any other publicly accessible location, including parking facilities, etc. Eligible entities can contract with a private entity to acquire, construct, install, maintain, or operate infrastructure. And for the community grants, priority is going to be given to projects that expand access to EV charging, alternative fueling infrastructure in rural areas, low and moderate income neighborhoods, and communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces to households, or a high ratio of multi-unit dwellings to single-family homes. So that's interesting. All right, let's move on. Another new program, electric vehicle formula program. EV, obviously the focus here, strategically deploying EV charging infrastructure. Funds distributed to states, both formula and discretionary. So eligible projects include things like acquisition or installation of EV charging infrastructure, operating assistance for a period not to exceed 5 years, etc. States have to submit a plan to DOT describing how they intend to use the distributed funds for each fiscal year. And then US DOT is going to report to Congress on that. Local law reserves $300 million for in FY22, that's the current fiscal year, to establish this joint office of energy and transportation between DOT, US DOT, and DOE. And those are a few highlights of that program. We can move on here to another new program, Congestion Relief Program, which is a discretionary program. It's to fund advanced, innovative, integrated, and multimodal solutions to reduce congestion. Let's see here, about $250 million. It's a competitive grant program. Eligible entities include state and local governments. Eligible projects include planning, deployment, and operation of integrated congestion management systems, HOV toll lanes, pricing strategies, etc. Incentivizing carpooling and non-highway travel during peak periods. So that's the new congestion relief discretionary program. There's some other provisions related to climate and resilience. Let's see, we have new EV charging standards that require EV charging infrastructure installed with federal funds to provide for non-proprietary charging connectors that meet industry standards. There's a report to Congress coming on emerging alt fuel vehicles and infrastructure. Requirement for FHWA also to address resilience needs in its regular conditions and performance report. So let's move on here to a little bit on some new bridge programs. A new bridge formula program to replace, rehab, preserve, protect, and construct bridges. It's this is formula. It's a complement to the discretionary bridge investment program, about $27.5 billion. Funds will be distributed by formula to the states, each state receiving a minimum of $45 million per year. States are required to reserve 15% of the formula funds under this program for use on off-system bridges. 3% of the program for general funded is set aside for tribal transportation facility bridges in this program. So that's the new bridge formula program. So this is the discretionary bridge investment program, another new bridge program here to improve bridge conditions and safety and efficiency, reliability. Total of about $12.5 billion. These funds will be distributed by competitive grant with eligible entities, including state, local governments, territorial, tribal governments. And the entities have to apply to DOT for these grants. This law allows DOT to award grants to certain large projects under multi-year grant agreements. An average about $40 million set aside for tribal transportation facilities, and about 1.5% of funds made available from the general fund for this program can be used for operations and administration of FHWA. So let's move on here quickly to equity. A couple of new programs related to that. So let's start with the new Reconnecting Communities pilot program, discretionary program. So this, oh, go ahead.
No, I skipped a slide, sorry.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So this is an interesting program. Kind of the idea here, you know, as many of you are aware, when the interstate system was built, at the time, there wasn't much consideration of the neighborhoods that were being affected and impacted, and there was emphasis on acquiring right of way that was as low cost as possible. And so there were many underserved minority communities that were really damaged when we approached things that way. This is kind of an interesting effort to provide some funds, some support to kind of reconnect programs by removing, retrofitting, or mitigating highways and other facilities that have created those barriers to community connectivity. So funding about a total of $1 billion over the federal reauthorization period. Two type of grants here. One is a planning grant for up to $2 million, for which states, MPOs, and others are eligible. And secondly, there are capital construction grants for $5 million or greater. Owners of eligible facilities are eligible to apply for those grants, and they can partner with any entity eligible for a planning grant. And such projects could include the removal and replacement of an eligible facility. So interesting new program there. Next, we will move on to rural transportation grants, a discretionary grant program. So this is another new program here, focusing on improving and expanding surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas to improve connectivity, safety, etc. So this act, it defines a rural area as any area outside an urbanized area with a population of over 200,000. And the funding is about $2 billion. Eligible entities include states, regional transportation planning organizations, etc. Eligible projects can include highway, bridge, or tunnel projects eligible under other broad federal aid funding categories. Highway freight projects are eligible under the NHFP that I mentioned earlier. Highway safety improvement projects, highway and bridge projects that improve access and support the rural economy. There are some set asides here for some other things, small projects less than $25 million, designated routes of the Appalachian Development Highway System, etc. So that is the Rural Surface Transportation Grants Discretionary Program. And let's talk a little bit about freight. Here, some new programs, some changes to existing programs. Let's get started with the next slide. So this is the new National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program, or MEGA projects, I should say. So this program is really designed to a discretionary program to provide funding through a single year or multi-year grant agreement for eligible projects. Eligible entities include states, MPOs, local governments, etc. Eligible projects are highway and bridge projects on the National Multimodal Freight Network, the National Highway Freight Network, or the NHS. Other eligible projects are freight intermodal, freight rail projects, for example, that provide a public benefit, rail highway grade separation or elimination projects. Half the funding is set aside for projects with cost of $500 million or more. So these are very large scale, obviously, projects, and the other half is reserved for projects with cost of more than 100 million, but less than 500 million, but still pretty big projects here. So that's another new program. Another new program here, local and regional project assistance. This is discretionary grant program for transportation infrastructure projects with significant local or regional impact. This also codifies the existing RAISE discretionary grant program that was previously established, formerly known as Tiger and Build, about $7.5 billion. Eligible entities, states, territories, local governments, etc. Eligible projects, highway and bridge projects, as well as public transportation projects and passenger or freight rail projects. So another new discretionary program there. The existing infra program, so this towards multimodal freight and highway projects of national or regional significance, some changes to that discretionary program. Adds eligibility for multi-state corridor organizations, for example. Adds eligibility for several types of projects, including highway, bridge, or freight projects on the National Multimodal Freight Network, marine highway corridor projects that are functionally connected to the National Highway Freight Network, wildlife crossing projects, surface transportation projects at international border crossing areas, allows up to 30% of infra funds to be used each year on non-highway freight projects, and some set-asides as well for rural areas. Okay. Reduction of truck emissions at port facilities, discretionary grant program to reduce truck idling and emissions at ports, including through the advancement of port electrification. So about 400 million for those types of projects. Includes competitive grants to test, evaluate, and deploy projects. The program also includes a study to address how ports and intermodal port transfer facilities could benefit from increased opportunities to reduce emissions at ports, etc. And some other general freight provisions that are in the new BIL, establishing a new Office of Multimodal Freight Infrastructure and Policy at the Office of the Secretary. Let's see. There's a new element to the National Freight Strategic Plan here as part of the BIL. Another provision requires state freight plans to include 7 new requirements and categories, including adequacy of commercial motor vehicle parking and rest facilities and some other items as well. And it also expands the list of organizational perspectives to be represented on the State Freight Advisory Committee, and it establishes some qualifications for that folks on that committee. And last but not least here, some planning and project delivery items here to highlight. So changes to the Metropolitan Planning Program, the MPO program, several changes here. First, when an MPO designates officials or representatives for the first time, so this would be for a new MPO, it requires consideration of equitable and proportional representation of the population served by the MPO. When in a situation where we have more than one MPO designated within an urbanized area, it requires the MPOs to ensure consistency of their planning data to the maximum extent practical. Third, it allows MPOs to use social media and web-based tools during the process to foster public participation. So it kind of adds that element. And a couple other provisions worth mentioning. The first requires US DOT to support state and MPO travel demand data and modeling, including a study, data, and an evaluation tool. The second requires that each MPO use at least 2.5% of their metropolitan planning federal funds on one or more activities to increase safe and accessible options for multiple travel modes for people of all ages and abilities, which may include activities such as adoption of complete street standards or policies or development of a complete streets prioritization plan. Okay, just a few more here and we'll be done. Another new program, prioritization process pilot program, a discretionary program, new program to essentially support data-driven approaches to planning, about $50 million. Eligible entities include states and larger MPOs. Grants can be awarded up to $2 million. It requires state and MPO recipients to develop and implement a publicly accessible, transparent process for the selection of projects for inclusion in their respective transportation planning documents. And if an entity has, or recipient has already implemented such a process, they can use remaining funds for other transportation planning purposes. So that's the prioritization process pilot program. And then one more here quickly, the transportation access pilot program that is new, supporting the development, distribution, and use of an open source data set on accessibility. And the data set needs to include measures of accessibility to jobs, education, services, etc. Eligible entities include states, MPOs, RTPOs, and the DOT must report to Congress on results of this program. So that's another pilot program. And that is a very 10,000-foot overview of what is in the BIL and what I thought would be of most interest to you all. There's a lot more that's in there. I know Colin has distributed fact sheets. There's tons of information out there that's available if you want more information. And Colin also provided some information on our planning emphasis areas, which were recently released from FHWA and FTA, and kind of address a lot of the same priorities of the legislation. It's some guidance that we issue for MPOs and states to consider as they develop their statewide planning and their UPWPs. The MPOs develop their UPWPs. It's guidance, it's not regulatory, but it's things that we encourage, and includes things that we've talked about here today, like complete streets, public involvement, tackling the climate crisis, resilience, equity, etc. So if you have a chance, you might want to take a look at that. It's just some more information that might be of interest. So how's that? How did I do? Are we okay?
That was pretty speedy. Yeah, there's a lot to cover. So I have just a couple of questions to follow up on some of the stuff you were talking about. First thing, for folks that don't aware, when Leigh was talking about sub-allocation, that is money dedicated to regions. So currently for the Transportation Alternative Program, for instance, the Nashua, like areas in urbanized areas with a population over 200,000 get a certain set aside of transportation alternative funding that they get to allocate to projects in their region. It doesn't flow through DOT. It's theirs to program projects. So can you say a little bit more about the different allocation levels for the 50,000 MPOs that SRPC is, that I hadn't heard anything about, like us getting sub-allocation authority? That's not changing, is it correct? I'm just making sure I didn't hear you right.
No, I don't think the sub-allocation authority is changing in a broad kind of way, I would say. But you're right. I mean, there are some programs here that I mentioned where those categories are changing, and so the amount of consultation that's maybe required between the MPO and the state when we talk about programming those funds for projects needs to be focused on and paid attention to as access is made available to the funding. But yeah, in terms of any kind of broad changes, I'm not sure that we have that with this legislation.
Can you confirm what you said, that highway safety funds can be used as the non-federal match for transportation alternatives projects? Did I read that right?
You did read that right. Yes, that is a change, a big change in the new legislation. That is correct.
I'll have to look up more about how that would work, but that could be really helpful for our smaller communities that want to do non-motorized transportation improvement. So yeah, I'll look that up. What did you mean by vulnerable road user for folks that
I
aren't
think
in the know?
probably the traditional understanding of that, which would be a non-motorized use, bike or pedestrian. You mean vulnerable? Yeah, sure. Vulnerable road users. Yeah, that traditional kind of understanding of what that is.
I just wanted to make sure. One other question. I've been talking to people about resilience projects and how we can be proactive in that, not waiting for the bridge or the culvert to fail and the road to blow out, but how can we get ahead of that sort of thing? You mentioned the match levels for the PROTECT program, which involves resilience. And we were talking about this yesterday, or I think it was yesterday at the PFP&H meeting, where you mentioned for states, but if we as an MPO developed a resilience plan, would that apply to us, where we could get, if a project is in a resilience plan at the regional level, the federal portion could be 87 and 13 local, and then could projects in our region get up to that 90-10 match level? or is that only for states? I think you said states in your presentation, but I wanted to make sure.
Yeah, let me try to find that. I don't know. Let's see. We're talking about the protect. Yeah. So we're talking about the protect and the formula. Well, there's the formula and the discretionary. So let me look here. Yeah, I'm looking at the formula information now, and you're right. It just references the state. So I don't have any information on that. Let's look at the discretionary program, and let's see. Share. Yeah, this one also just talks state. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure about that, I guess is the answer, and we'll have to wait and see if there's going to be some more guidance. But for now, it looks like that's just addressing state eligible entities.
Okay. The last thing before I start talking and turn it over to other people is just the overall picture on this. There is funding from the BIL that goes to states for them to allocate to projects, and then the discretionary programs. So if any of you folks from the municipalities or agencies in our region have a project in mind, the sooner you come talk to me, the better, and we can get those developed and get ready for some of these discretionary programs, because they're going to start becoming available. We're still waiting for the final rulemakings on what all the eligibility requirements and stuff are. But if you have a sidewalk project or a multi-use path or a safety improvement thing, come talk to me and we can start developing it. And because the federal application process is lengthy for any of these. So I just wanted to make that point.
Yep, that's a good point. And as the guidance comes out, I'll be sure to share it with you guys at all the MPOs and RPCs. Just a lot more to come. I think we have the law. There's good information in it, but a lot of these programs, they're they need to be more fully developed in terms of what the process is going to be, especially the discretionary programs and how that's going to work. So stay tuned for more information on that. And there might be also some opportunities for, to receive public comment on the development of some of that information, the rules, the regulatory requirements that'll be coming from this.
Yep.
And if you have any feedback on the presentation, since this is the first time I've done one, feel free to forward it to me or to Colin, and he can get it to me. But I plan on doing a few more of these, which is great. And so again, I really appreciate the opportunity here for you guys to be the first.
Thank you.
Tim, do you have a thought?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Hi, Lee. We were in the process of looking. We were told that there was going to be some further guidance from Federal Highways on the 2 EV charging programs sometime this month. I'm just wondering if you have any indication on when you think that's going to be coming out.
No, I don't, unfortunately. I'd say, if that's what they're saying this month, hopefully that's what it'll be, but I haven't heard anything more than that on that.
Okay, I'm assuming that if I just keep checking the Federal Register every day, I'll eventually hook up with it. So.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to include you on any of the distribution of whatever information comes in on that too. So between the two, between what you're doing, what I'm doing, hopefully you'll get the information as soon as possible. But yeah, I haven't heard anything more about that recently.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lee.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions from folks on the various programs? Overarching?
Well, the only one that I had, and I can't remember what section it was, there, I think it was right at the top of your presentation, you had a matrix up that showed who could apply for these different programs, and especially the discretionary ones. There was one of them on that slide that the state couldn't apply. This is the one.
Okay, there, let's see.
I'm
let's see what I can-
looking at, I think I'm looking at the one that is the Rural Surface Transportation Grant and the National Electric Vehicle Formula. I guess the state can do it and the local jurisdiction can do it on those two. So the question I have is, who do we go to first? Do we still go to the Regional Planning Commission to assist us with any of those potential project applications?
I'll kind of defer to,
Because the MPO is not
Colin.
called out there.
right.
Which programs, Bruce?
Well, it's the third one, National Electric Vehicle Formula Program. It just shows that the funding is available to the state and to the local communities, and also the Rural Surface Transportation Grants. It's the same way.
Yeah. So I mean, we're not eligible to apply for the funding, but we can certainly help
Okay.
municipalities apply and do technical assistance and anything to kind of, you know, help back up. But yeah, we just, if we have a check mark in the MPO column there, that just means that we could, as an MPO, apply for that funding, but we as an
All right.
MPO would also have to have the local match
I understand now.
in some
Thanks
way.
for clarifying.
Right.
And I get the sense, Leigh, that there is some, well, can you speak to any interconnectivity between projects or between programs here where, are there any benefits that you know of to kind of getting the most bang for your buck? So Milton put in a 10-year plan project recently that involved stormwater utility improvements. So have you heard of any benefits? This probably comes out in the rulemaking, but emphasis on doing the highway project at the same time as your stormwater utility or other electric utilities. Have you heard of any emphasis on kind of doing that sort of thing?
I have not, to be honest, so I don't know. I mean, that kind of makes sense that would be something to consider in the process of evaluating a discretionary grant proposal, for example, but I couldn't say for sure whether that's going to be part of the process or considered in the award of funds. But as you say, you know, we should be getting more information about each of these discretionary grant programs. I'm sure is going to have their own separate guidance and rules, perhaps, that we'll see, where hopefully we'll get some more information about that. But you know, we'll just have to wait and see.
And folks are welcome to reach out to me or Leigh and as you get more information about these programs. I set myself up with little email alerts. So I'll see when rulemakings come in from federal highways. This is just kind of the highway program stuff. There's also other rail specific programs, and there are also environmental programs. There's a lot of environmental money out there through the BIL for things like wetland restoration, something called living shorelines, where you basically build a wetland or you grow a wetland so that it takes care of any storm surge, helps with storm surge issues and sea level rise. So there are a lot of programs and projects like that that are related to transportation. You know, if we can get a wetland to do to absorb storms rather than building a wall, that has some benefit. So there's a lot of tie-ins there.
Yeah, and some of these programs are completely new. We've really never had specific discrete programs addressing climate change, resiliency, equity in the way that this legislation does. So it's all very new, and it's all going to take some time to roll out the guidance and the rulemaking for all of this stuff. So we'll have to be kind of patient and wait and see as things develop. But as soon as information becomes available that I'm aware of, I'll make sure I send it out and share it with everybody.
And last thing I'll mention in the short term, the BIL includes additional funding that goes to states for programs like transportation alternatives and congestion management. So the State Department of Transportation will be issuing a solicitation for projects under those programs. Not anytime soon, and no timeline on that, but more money in those programs means they will be able to fund more projects. Hypothetically, I won't speak for DOT, but there will be funding opportunities through those. So it's not a federal application process. It's a state process that we can help with as well. So just wanted to make a note of that. So again, if you have project ideas and you want to run them by, if you don't have engineers on staff or anything, we're here to help.
Great. I guess we're going to ask one final time if there's anyone else that has any questions or comments for Leigh. And seeing none, thank you, Leigh. That's a great presentation. Lots of information for sure.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Appreciate the opportunity.
Colin, what's next on your amended agenda here? Is it updates from communities, or is it asking the public if they have anything to say?
One sec. I think we're just down to other business, but let me make sure what is happening. Too many buttons to push. Yeah, we're just down to other business and citizens forum if there are any local updates. I'll just mention that the 10-year plan is moving through the legislature and getting positive reviews, and I fully expect that to go smoothly. I'm tracking other bills that are related to transportation, but they're all still in committee discussions and so forth. So I haven't seen any committee votes on ought to pass or anything like that. But as it's 10:30, I'll leave it up to any local updates from municipalities or agencies.
And seeing none so far, I think that I would entertain that wonderful motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Michael.
I'll second, Michelle.
All right, there's no discussion on this motion. I guess we still need to have the roll call vote.
I think we're okay to not have a roll call vote for the last one, right, Jen? We weren't doing that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vote with your feet, as
Motion,
Brad
a
Nichols will say.
second, and then adieu. À la prochaine.
So if
Thank
leave
you
the
all.
meeting,
Have a good
vote
weekend.
again.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Don't drive if you don't have to.
Thanks, everybody.
I'm going to
Thank you,
Vermont.
Lee.